I ordered him, "Herney, in front of you is the village of Suslovka, but Dvuzhilny's men are already in it. Go around it on the left. Piatirikov will go around on the right. Do not stop. Move faster to the northern outskirts of Kankovichi." "Roger," answered the commander. "Advance on Kankovichi." "Now give me Piatirikov," I said to the radio operator. At this time Captain Dvuzhilny came to us. I had to reprimand him. "It's not the business of the commander to run to the attacks himself. I saw how you are now carried away, and you need to manage the battalion." And he said peacefully, "Listen to the task. The 1st Battalion is bypassing the village on the left. Piatirikov will go around it on the right. Your battalion will go to the 2nd echelon. Is the task clear?" "But how can it be, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel? I still owe the fascists a debt." "All of us will ask them in due time," I interrupted the commander. "In the meantime, carry out your orders." After my words, Captain Dvuzhilny somehow shrank, lowered his head. His cheekbones were getting jaundiced, and I did not know at that time what lay under the word debt. I learned about it after the war, somewhere in the 60s. I learned from a letter from the writer G.N. Frolov, the author of the book about the glorious daughter of the Soviet people, partisan Vera Voloshina. Vera, like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, being a scout, was captured and executed by the Nazis, and now George Nikolaevich, having learned that in his school days his heroine was friends with Yuri Dvuzhilny, wrote me, his former commander, a letter. And I remembered the Belarusian village Suslovka, the battle, the Commander 3 Captain Dvuzhilny, his protest against the withdrawal of the battalion to the 2nd echelon of the regiment. After all, in his chest burned inexorably thirst for revenge against the fascist executioners who tortured his first love, Vera. But then, I repeat, I didn't know that. And even if I had, after all, the situation demanded the withdrawal of Captain Dvuzhilny's shattered battalion to the 2nd echelon. By the evening of June 23rd, the regiment reached the northern outskirts of the village of Kankovichi and the forest south of it. And here it was met with heavy enemy fire. It was dusk, and it is still necessary to collect the regiment, battalions of which stretched along the front for as much as 5 kilometres. In addition, the 1st Battalion was even in the band of the 885th Rifle Regiment, advancing on the left. So it happened in the dynamics of the battle, reported by radio to the division commander on the regiment's fulfillment of the task of the day. He immediately gave me a new one for the next day. From it, I understood that in the morning the regiment was to develop the offensive further, south of the village of Hankovichi, to force the Basia River, to seize a bridgehead on its western bank, and in the middle of the day to ensure the entry into the battle of the 2nd echelon of the division, the 882nd Infantry Regiment. The Basia River is a tributary of the Pronya. Its width reaches 15 to 20 metres. It will have to ford it on the move. The regiment has no regular means of crossing, except for a few boats. There is no time to prepare improvised means and make rafts out of them, as it was when forcing Pronya. On the western bank of Basi is the 2nd defensive line of Hitlerites on the outskirts of Mogilev, and it will surely be occupied by the morning by the enemy units, which are retreating from here and approaching from the depths. Consequently, the river would have to be forced under fire. There was only one conclusion: to find shallow places, to lead battalions to them, and to ford the Basia. I set this task to the head of reconnaissance, regimental engineer. The scouts returned at dawn. Captain M.M. Zagainov reported that found 2 fords, a little more than 1 metre deep, showed on the map ways to approach them. "Defence on the west bank of the river," said the captain. "Occupy the retreating Hitlerite units. It was not possible to capture a prisoner to clarify the presence of fresh units. The night is too short." The report of the Chief of Intelligence made some adjustments to the decision made in the evening. The 3rd Battalion had to be immediately redirected to the left, to move to the river through the forest, where the Nazis have not yet taken up defences. In addition, this way and closer to one of the 2 fords. and its capture will cut off the escape route to the enemy units, covering the approaches to the river Basia. And the 1st Battalion is best to conduct covertly, through the forest, following the 3rd Battalion. The task of the 2nd Battalion did not change. It was to attack the enemy on the unnamed height, covering the approaches to the right ford, and by its active actions to divert the Hitlerites' attention from the 3rd and 1st Battalions. From the evening, the attack was scheduled for 7 Ursas. But because of the amendments to the situation, its beginning should have been postponed to 8 Ursas. I reported my decision to the division commander. General Gasparian listened to me attentively, but he did not agree with the postponement of the start of the attack for a long time. "Do you guarantee the success of the regiment?" the commander asked me time and again. "You will not disrupt the 2nd echelon in the battle on the other bank?" I answered that there was no other way out. If not captured at least one ford, the river will have to force the preparation, and it will generally drag on for a whole day. After much hesitation, the division commander still gave his consent. At 7:43, Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski's artillerymen opened fire. For the 3rd Battalion, it was a signal to start stealthy, along the gully and bushes, advance to the forest with the subsequent exit to its direction to fulfill the task. The 2nd Battalion prepared to attack the unnamed height, and the 1st, together with the regiment's sapper company and wagons loaded with timber and wooden boats, concentrated in a deep gully in readiness to follow the 3rd Battalion to the river. From the attic of a dilapidated barn, apparently formerly used as a field camp, Wojciechowski and I watched all the movements of the regiment's units. Through binoculars it was clearly visible how the 3rd Battalion began to pull into the forest, and in a minute or two the 2nd Battalion went to attack the height. The artillery immediately increased fire on its eastern slopes. But soon, seeing a series of red rockets toward the enemy, fired by the commander of the 2nd Battalion, which meant the transfer of artillery fire in depth, Wojciechowski concentrated it already along the crest of the height. Suddenly a fierce machine gun fire broke out on the left in the woods where the 3rd Battalion had gone. It alarmed. Did the Hitlerites guess our plan? Meanwhile, the fight in the forest was heating up. Hand grenades were bursting. Machine guns came into action. Machine guns were shooting even more often. What happened there? "Combat 3 asks you, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," reported the radio operator. I put on my earphones. Captain Dvuzhilny reported, "Met in the forest up to a company of machine gunners. Fighting. Please help artillery." "Is the division commander with you?" "With me." "Give me coordinates for artillery." "So much for the enemy-free forest. A mistake has been made. We should have left scouts there and kept watch until morning, but that's a late thought. By the sounds of battle, it is felt that the enemy in front of the 3rd Battalion is strong, and it's unlikely that it's just a company. What should we do? The Hitlerites have no solid defence in the forest, of course, and the machine gunners apparently have been put forward here recently. After all, after the scouts had been there, returning from the river, a little more than 2 hours had passed. Yes, we need to find the enemy's open flank and go to his rear. But will Dvuzhilny himself be able to do it, or is it better to send to him those who have already been there? Scouts? That's a thought. I ordered to call to me the commander of the reconnaissance platoon. The 2nd Battalion at this time is still engaged in a fierce battle for the unnamed height. Only now reflects a counterattack of up to 50 Nazi machine gunners on his right flank. The left flank companies, although slowly, but still moving to the crest of the height. The situation for the regiment is not quite favourable. Battalions are advancing in independent directions, without maintaining between themselves neither tactical nor fire interaction. In addition, the wooded terrain does not allow artillerymen to more effectively use their fire to support them. Still, it is necessary to continue to fulfill the original plan. There is no other way out yet. The commander of the regiment's reconnaissance platoon, Senior Lieutenant Mayakin, came running. I asked him what direction he was returning from the river at dawn. Mayakin showed on the map. Yes, this is where the battle was now simmering in the forest. It turns out that my assumptions are correct. The fascists had moved their machine gunners here recently, about an hour and a half ago, and during this time you can't get a proper foothold. So there are open flanks. We need to help the 3rd Battalion, Alexei, I said to the commander of the reconnaissance platoon. Take your men, go around the Hitlerites and hit them from the rear. Then move to the ford, take the defence there and cut off the enemy escape routes to the other side of the river. Is the task clear? Everything will be done, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, answered Mayakin, and the battle for the height is getting stronger. The 2nd Battalion has already laid down on the very crest of the height. Captain Pyatyrikov reports that the fascists are giving him stubborn resistance from the back slopes, and neither he nor the artillerymen can see where the enemy has machine guns behind the slopes. True, our artillery is now firing on areas, and it does not give the desired effect. What are we going to do, Combrig? I asked Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski. We need to move the correctors forward, he replied. Give the commander a command to cover my scouts, and I will put the necessary task to the division commander. Maybe something will work out. I talked on the radio with Captain Pyatyrikov. He said that he and Balavas will take measures now. While Wojciechowski and I were clarifying the situation and giving appropriate orders to the commander of the 2nd Battalion and the commander of the artillery division, the regimental scouts had already drawn into the forest. I warned the commander of the 3 about the task received by the scouts, told him to watch their actions too. As soon as in the rear of the Nazis burst shooting, let him immediately raise the battalion and forward to the river. Time passed, and the scouts did not give any news about themselves. The 3rd Battalion was still fighting hard in the forest. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, Senior Lieutenant Mayakin reports, at last the regimental chief of staff informed me. Where is he and what is he doing? He went to the fascists' rear, asking permission to start. Well done, Alexei, I burst out with joy. Let him start. Tell Captain Dvuzhilny about it. The Chief of Staff went to the radio station again, and Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski and I began to observe the results of target shooting on the reverse slopes of the height with binoculars. We simply did not see the first bursts. The shells lay far behind the crest of the height. Then columns of dark smoke appeared closer. My guys are taking the fork, said Wojciechowski. So the adjusters see the targets. Be patient, Mikhail. He clapped me on the shoulder. We'll soon cover it. I wish it was sooner. We have to move at least 1 battalion. Now. Wojciechowski shouted to his calculators to get ready to receive data from Balavas for other divisions. At that time, deep in the forest, they heard the thud of grenades and heavy machine gun fire. Mayakin! Shouted at the observation post at the same time several people. That's right, it's him. There are anti-tank grenades bursting. I remembered how back in the winter the Chief of Staff of the regiment, Major T.G. Gladky, said that Mayakin does not recognize any other grenades than anti-tank grenades. They are especially good, argued the commander of the reconnaissance platoon, when taking tongues, when you need to make as much noise as possible and strike fear into the enemy. And now he is also scaring the Nazis. Tell Dvuzhilny, let him raise the men in the attack. I ordered the Chief of Staff. And my artillerymen are ready for a fire attack. Reported at this time Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski. The commander of the 2nd Battalion was also called to the radio station. Fire raid, Pyatyrikov, I told him. We'll start in 2 minutes. Duration, 5 minutes. With its beginning, raise the battalion to the attack, act vigorously, attack non-stop, and get to the river faster. Roger, replied the commander. I'm starting to act. There came agonizing minutes of waiting. Will, at least now, the battalions break the resistance of the Nazis? And who is the first, Pyatyrikov or Dvuzhilny? After all, who will be the first to go to the river? The battalion of the 2nd echelon will follow. And if again there will be a misfire at both of them? What then? No, away from that thought. Here, already behind the ridge, appeared the first flashes of the fire attack. Behind them lay a second line of shells, The whole height was shrouded in smoke. Captain Pyatirikov's company came up. The first group of soldiers had already jumped out on the crest of the height, and behind it, the whole chain. And here it began to hide behind the crest, pulling in on the reverse slopes. Through binoculars you can see how the artillery crews of the regimental battery of Lieutenant A.G. Gladyshev rolled out and set their guns on the ridge. "Well done, artillerymen!" A sigh of relief comes out. "Now the height is ours. What about Dvuzhilny?" I shout to the Chief of Staff. "He's moving forward. The fascists are retreating." I make a phone call to the division commander and report that the regiment has captured the height on the right flank and is clearing the forest of enemy machine gunners on the left. General Gasparian grumbles that it would be high time for me to be on the western bank of the Basie River and demands to be on the other side of the river in an hour and report to him from there. Now it would be a good time to move the second echelon, but behind whom? How was it decided before? But on the right flank, Pyatirikov's battalion, having broken the enemy's resistance on the heights, is advancing quite rapidly to the river. But here the approaches to it, the fascists are watching and for sure shot through. And on the left, Dvuzhilny is still slowly pushing Hitlerites out of the forest, and yet its edge is close to the river at the ford. Here battalions can surreptitiously prepare and begin forcing. So who to follow? Decision-making by a commander, especially during a battle, is a difficult process. How many times until the end of the war had to weigh all these pros and cons? How many minutes, agonizing to the point of pain, had to endure our brother commander from small to great? But that's what a commander is. You must think and weigh, worry and agonize, search and find, because you are entrusted with the most valuable thing, the fates and lives of people. And you must always make the best decision to win, and to win with as little blood as possible. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion was still standing in the gully behind the 3rd, in readiness to enter into action, and its commander, Capt. P. Herney, was with me at the observation post, and waiting for orders. Yes, it is necessary to ask him what he thinks, where and how best to act his battalion. After all, he was the first to force the river, the first to seize the bridgehead, to repel enemy counterattacks. Captain Herney, a judicious commander, never makes rash decisions. And to my question now, he also answered wisely, "I need to bring to the river a combat-ready, not shabby battalion. Move it behind the 2nd, on the right flank. It is closer to the river, of course, but to lead it in front of the enemy, under his fire, with losses even before the main thing. Is it worth it?" Combat was right. And, having clarified with him a few more questions, I ordered to move after the 3rd Battalion. Herney went to his companies. We received a radiogram from Senior Lieutenant Mayakin. He, it turns out, has already gone to the river and took the defence at the ford. Well done. Now pace, pace. And yet we started forcing the river only at 15 or so. Before that, we had to finish off the fascists on our eastern bank. Before the forcing, we made an 18-minute artillery preparation on the enemy defence. The fire on the other side of the fords was concentrated with good density, so both our battalions overcame the river without much difficulty. And for an hour, they advanced to the depth of the enemy defence up to 1.5 kilometres. But here they were stopped by strong rifle gun and mortar fire. Besides, at 16 they were counterattacked by up to 2 battalions of fascist infantry with 6 tanks. By this time, the 2nd Battalion of Captain Pyatyrikov came to the bridgehead, and, having turned from behind the left flank, he crushed one of the counter-attacking enemy battalions and pushed it into the forest. Another enemy battalion with 6 tanks, aimed mainly at the 3rd Battalion, managed to squeeze the 7th Company, but was also stopped, and the tanks, having passed the Battalion Dvuzhilny's fighting order, 200-300 metres before the river came across Lieutenant Gladyshev's battery. 2 of them were immediately hit by our artillerymen. The rest hastily withdrew behind the fighting order of their lying infantry. By evening, when the enemy counterattack was already completely repulsed, the division commander, Major General I.G. Gasparian, and the head of the political department, Colonel I.M. Polyakov arrived at the bridgehead. The commander again expressed his dissatisfaction with the fact that we still slowly forced the river and did not ensure the timely entry into the battle of the second echelon of the division. Then he took out his map and showed me where the regiment should go by the morning of June 25th. I, in turn, asked Gasparian where our neighbour on the left, the 885th Rifle Regiment, was. During the past day we had not only no elbow communication with it, but no communication at all. True, somewhere in the woods, behind us, a battle was heard. But who was leading it, we don't know. "And you don't look back at your neighbours, carry out your task," General Gasparian answered me. Having provided the regiment's units with ammunition and everything else necessary for the battle, in the morning we resumed moving forward in the direction of the settlements of Koroshki and Kiselki. The second echelon of the division, the 882nd Rifle Regiment, now entered the battle on the left. With a friendly attack of 2 regiments on a narrow, only 4 kilometres wide, the division easily knocked down the enemy cover units and, having overcome the woods, by 11 o'clock in the afternoon was already on the approaches to the river Resta. As expected, the enemy with its main forces had time overnight to take a fairly strong defence on the opposite bank of the river. This was confirmed by our reconnaissance. Senior Lieutenant Mayakin, who had been with his men at the Resta, returned with a German map on which the whole situation was visible. The map, as it turned out, belonged to a Hitler officer, who came across the platoon of our reconnaissance on an armoured personnel carrier. The scouts hit the armoured personnel carrier, killed several Nazis, including the lieutenant. And now we have this map. It helped us to study the enemy's defence, to make the right decision to put battalions into battle, to plan the artillery fire. The river Resta was not a big obstacle for us, but it was the penultimate intermediate line of the enemy's defence before the Dnieper. Therefore it was to be expected that Hitlerites would fight here with great persistence. Observing the enemy's defence, Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski and I sketched on our maps the scheme of fires for suppression of enemy targets, the boundaries of deployment and attack of the regiment. By the way, between the forest and the Resta River lay a flat, open plain, which had been shelled by the enemy's artillery. Even today, several of his batteries shelled the edge of the forest and scouts who were approaching the river. The opposite bank of the river was also gentle, with a gradual rise to the west. Therefore, the Hitlerites' defence was created like terraces. The second trench as if overhanging the first, which allowed to fire simultaneously from both of them. To overcome the river and converge with the enemy, the regiment needed at least 25 minutes of time. Therefore, the question arose as to the duration of the artillery preparation. I insisted on planning it for 30 minutes, but Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski reported that he was given only half of the ammunition for the entire day of battle. That is, the number of shells that can generally be fired in half an hour. And then, throughout the day, remain without artillery support? Having reported the situation to the division commander, I asked him to add at least 0.2 more shells for the day. Gasparian, as usual, grumbled into the phone, reproached me that I was asking him too much and too often, that it was necessary to be able to fight not by quantity, but by skill. But at the end of the conversation he still promised to add shells. In the mortar battery of the regiment and battalion mortars, ammunition overnight brought enough. But it was not possible to use these units in fire training, because the distance from the edge of the forest, where it was possible to equip firing positions for mortars, and to the first enemy trench was large, and 82mm mortars simply would not reach them. And it was impossible to move the mortars forward, because the terrain was as flat as a palm. That's why it was decided to use all 6 divisions of Wojciechowski, and only the mortar battery of the regiment for artillery preparation. Battalion mortars during the artillery preparation should directly in the fighting order of rifle units to approach the enemy, and, having reached a point from which it will be possible to hit the enemy, deploy and open fire on the instructions of battalion commanders. Artillery preparation began at exactly 9 Cs, and immediately rose and went forward 2nd and 3rd Battalions. Their task, under cover of artillery fire as quickly as possible to overcome the open plain and to force the river. In the battalion's fighting order moved and anti-tank platoons of 45 mm guns, mortar companies. Artillerymen, having overtaken the rifle chains, were the first to reach the riverbank, turned around, and having taken positions for direct fire, opened fire. The riders at full gallop immediately drove their horses back into the forest, as there was nowhere to hide them. Minrots also moved on wagons closer to the river. Here the calculators removed mortars, set them up, and opened fire. There were still 7 or 8 minutes left until the end of the artillery preparation, when first the 3rd, followed by the 2nd Battalion, began to overcome the river. The artillerymen intensified their fire on the first enemy trench and also on the eastern edge of the village of Good, where the 3rd Battalion was to attack after forcing the river. Having crossed the river, the companies of both battalions, scattered in a chain, went on the attack. The 2nd Battalion took the first trench with comparative ease and began to advance to the 2nd trench in a friendly manner. The 3rd Battalion, on the other hand, had a hitch. Its companies, not having reached the first enemy trench only a few metres, suddenly stopped abruptly. Through binoculars you could see how the soldiers fell, cut down by machine gun bursts, almost at point-blank range. Others lay down, and only a small group from the 9th Company of Junior Lieutenant S.P. Strumeftova broke into the trench. I notice 2 fascist machine guns beat from behind the outermost houses, and in the 2nd trench, which passes almost near the houses, along the vegetable garden, Hitlerites accumulate. I point this out to Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski. He corrects the fire of his divisions. Machine guns are silenced. Enemy machine gunners from the 2nd trench are dispersed. But some machine guns still pinned to the ground with dagger fire, 2 companies of Battalion Dvuzhilny. Would the 3rd Battalion's attack be suffocated? But what is it? From the river to the lying companies runs a group of fighters. In the middle, a tall figure of the commander. Here Captain Dvuzhilny equalled the companies, stopped for a second, shouted something, and was the first to rush to the village. The companies also went up. The soul was relieved. They were going forward. But, in front of the houses, the soldiers again lay down. The figure of the commander flashed again and disappeared, and enemy machine guns were already firing somewhere behind the houses. In the distance, on the right, also rattles cannonade. It's the main forces of the 49th Army developing an offensive to the north of us, and from the firebag formed between them and our corps, the enemy is hurrying to withdraw his units so that they would not get surrounded. In particular, the highway to Mogilev passes through the village of Sukhari, which is 1.5 kilometers northwest of Koroshek. And, as our intelligence reported, the enemy troops are retreating along it in a continuous stream. Therefore it is quite clear that Hitlerites will also try not to surrender Koroshki to us until they completely withdraw their units behind the Dnieper. Hence such stubbornness. And we need to build up the blow, and if not to take, then bypass the village from the south to cut the highway to Mogilev. But it's better to take Koroshki. We'll put into battle the 1st Battalion from the left flank of the 2nd, I said to Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski. Dvuzhilny came on the radio, reported that in the village up to a battalion of enemy infantry. In every house, in barns, in cellars and cellars, are sitting fascists and fighting desperately. I told Dvuzhilny that Piatirikov with one of his companies would now help him to take possession of the village of Koroshki. I warned him to act carefully, not to risk himself and take care of the men. Tufati also informed me that Captain Chudov, acting chief of artillery of the regiment, had arrived. I knew that. I also knew another thing. As chief of artillery, maybe he should not have gone to the rifle battalion. But A.S. Chudov for a long time commanded in the 3rd Battalion Minesweeper Company, and in a difficult moment wanted to be with his men. And the situation demanded that at this difficult moment there was another experienced commander. So I, 1/4 hour ago, granted Chudov's request, let him go to the battalion, and, As Dvuzhilny reported, he immediately began to skillfully smoke out Hitlerites from houses and barns with mortar fire. To my great regret, I did not have to see these two remarkable commanders again. Captains Dvuzhilny and Chudov in the village of Koroshki were killed by shrapnel of a mine that exploded nearby. Captain Y.M. Dvuzhilny, for his heroism and courage, was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The 1st Battalion immediately began to advance rapidly to the highway, and with it, the left flank of the 2nd Battalion. The right flank company of Lieutenant M.T. Chintenkov, trying to seize the western outskirts of the village of Koroshki, was met with fire from several Nazi machine guns and lay down, and only by concentrating all the fire of artillery on the village, as well as advancing to direct fire regimental battery of Lieutenant A.G. Gladyshev, we were able to clear the village of Koroshki from the enemy by evening. By this time, I, with the main forces of the regiment, was already on the outskirts of the Dnieper. With the 3rd Battalion remained the Chief of Staff, who reported to me about the capture of the village and the death of Captains Dvuzhilny and Chudov. Meanwhile, Hitlerites tried to use literally every obstacle, every heightened settlement to organize defense, and at least for an hour or two to delay the advance of our units to the Dnieper. 8 kilometers east of the Dnieper bend flows a small river Rudea, a tributary of the Resta. Here the regiment, as well as other parts of the division, was again stopped by enemy fire from the prepared defense line. To break through it was not so easy. It was necessary to first pull up artillery and the 3rd Battalion, and then to concentrate all these forces in a fairly narrow area. To attack on a wider front, forces would still not be enough. After all, for 4 days of heavy fighting, the regiment suffered significant losses. Especially many of the command staff was out of action, and yet by noon the enemy from the boundary of the Rudea River was shot down and began to withdraw. By this time the main forces of the 49th Army north of Mogilev and the 50th Army south of it began to force the Dnieper and develop the offensive towards Minsk, thus creating a threat of encirclement for the Mogilev group of enemy troops. The 290th Infantry Division was ordered to force the Dnieper and seize Mogilev in cooperation with the 121st Infantry Corps of the 50th Army, advancing from the south. By evening, our regiment approached the Dnieper. This large river was to be crossed with improvised means. Again, we used saws, axes. No matter how much the division commander hurried us, we could start forcing the Dnieper only at 1 o'clock in the morning. By that time, the scouts had already determined the landing places of the units on the western bank, hidden exits from the water's edge to the high precipitous bank, to the enemy trenches. With the 1st Battalion went I, with the 2nd, Deputy for Political Part Major G.T. Petushkov. Lieutenant Colonel B.K. Wojciechowski remained on the eastern bank in readiness to fire his divisions at our call. The first to force the Dnieper was Lieutenant Strakov's company. The organization was high, the soldiers acted silently. That's why our attack caught the enemy by surprise. 2 trenches were taken easily, almost without losses. The enemy left on the battlefield up to 100 dead and 60 prisoners. Exceptional courage and bravery were shown by Junior Sergeants Azovtsev and Blintsov, as well as the company commander Tomilovsky. They were the first to break into the enemy trench, destroyed more than 10 fascists with grenades, captured a bunker. When the 3rd Battalion, mortar and artillery units of the regiment began to cross, it was getting light. That's when the enemy came to his senses and opened quite a dense fire. We also did not stay in debt. Artillerymen of Lieutenant Colonel Wojciechowski immediately detected enemy batteries and reliably suppressed them. By 8 in the morning, the battalions of the 1st Echelon, having moved forward 3 or 4 kilometres, were stopped by the enemy. The 1st Battalion, at small heights by infantry fire, the 2nd, counter-attack from the south, from the village of Borovka, forces up to a battalion with 6 tanks. The 882nd Rifle Regiment forded the river just to our right and immediately turned aside. Between it and our regiment, there was a gap of 2.5–3 kilometres, and ahead, Mogilev, a large city, a regional, political, administrative and industrial centre. and despite the fact that the troops of 2 Soviet armies had already bypassed it, advanced far to the west, it continued to remain at the enemy. True, the Hitlerites' defence was cracking here at all seams. Cracked, but was not yet broken. And to do this, we had to build up our forces, pull up artillery and other means of reinforcement, and there was no bridge across the Dnieper, over which they could be transported. Meanwhile, the enemy became more active, again counterattacked our 2nd Battalion. Machine guns are good against infantry, but what can they do with tanks? They were the ones who broke into the battalion's fighting order, almost crushed the 6th Company. Almost, but not completely. At the most critical moment of the battle, Sergeant Ivanishin, the company's Komsomol leader, rose from the trench, followed by several other Komsomol members. They stopped the heels, organized fire on the enemy, and the Komsomol leader with an anti-tank grenade crawled towards the Nazi tank that was advancing on him, and when it came closer to him, he threw a grenade under the track. Almost immediately another enemy tank caught fire. It was hit by other soldiers of the company, who were already encouraged by the example of the Komsorg, shattering lines sent to the enemy and machine gunner D.B. Mamontov. He was wounded twice, but he continued to fire, destroyed more than 40 fascists, and only the 3rd bullet tore the brave from the machine gun. For this feat, Red Army man Mamontov was posthumously awarded the high rank of Hero of the Soviet Union. That day the 2nd Battalion repelled 6 enemy counterattacks, and did not retreat. But on the left flank of the regiment, things were worse. Here up to a company of enemy infantry managed to break through to the river. There was a threat of disrupting the flooding of the pontoon bridge, at which the division sappers were already busy. But the 3rd Battalion, which by that time had crossed to the western bank, crushed this group and cleared the bank from the enemy, courageously fought at the heights and the 1st Battalion. He also repulsed several enemy counterattacks. At dawn on June 29th, the 1st and 2nd Battalions again tried to move forward to Mogilev. But even this attempt was not successful. There was an acute shortage of artillery and heavy weapons in general, which were on the east bank of the Dnieper, and there was no bridge across it, as already mentioned. And then a new surprise. Lieutenant Colonel B.K. Wojciechowski, the commander of the artillery brigade, who remained on the eastern bank, came on the phone and said that he was leaving for another direction. The hour is not easier from hour to hour. What am I to fight with now? They say miracles don't happen. Yes, they do. Otherwise, how else to explain the fact that the 2nd Battalion finally broke into the eastern outskirts of Mogilev and took a foothold in one of the streets there? And another miracle. Unexpectedly, the artillery division of the artillery regiment of the division headed by its commander Major I.A. Larionov crossed the bridgehead. And in addition, 4 T-34 tanks. It became easier to breathe, figuratively speaking. Most of all, we were worried about the area of the railway station, turned by the enemy into a fairly strong fortified junction. Here were concentrated several of his artillery and mortar batteries, and from the water pumping station, from the building of the half-destroyed station and other stone buildings, all approaches were well viewed and machine-gunned. It was possible to smoke the enemy out of there only by the fire of guns, put at direct aiming. Scouts returned from the city. Senior Lieutenant Mayakin reported that the Opera House is also heavily guarded, and in the park, behind the theatre, are camouflaged cars. Apparently, some kind of headquarters was located here. Immediately I had an idea. What if we create 2 assault groups? One, to get to the rear of the Hitlerites, who were defending the railway station, and the other, to capture the theatre and eliminate the alleged headquarters in it. It was agreed. The task to seize the railroad station was given to the 1st Battalion Hirnogo. Personally leading one of his companies, the captain approached the station from the western side, defeating a mortar battery of the enemy. By 15 Wans, his battalion by blows from 2 directions seized the station. Up to 100 Hitlerites were destroyed, and about 200 were taken prisoner. The trophies of the battalion were rich: 2 self-propelled installations, Ferdinand, 18 guns, 12 mortars, more than 24 machine guns and several hundred automatic rifles. The captured Nazi officer, who led the defence of the station, testified at the interrogation that he had the task to defend until the railroad train with the headquarters of the commandant of the Mogilev garrison was sent. But the train was not sent to the station, and for what reason, he does not know. Courage and enviable ingenuity was shown in this battle by the party commander of the 1st Battalion, Senior Lieutenant I.E. Moshkov. With a troop of machine gunners, planted on 2 tanks, he broke through one of the streets in the centre of the city, captured the buildings of the Regional Committee and the Regional Executive Committee, then turned around and came from the rear to the railroad station. Tankers at point-blank range shot several machine gun nests from guns, and machine gunners under cover of this fire broke into the station building itself. This is what decided the outcome of the battle. Later, Motkov, with the same tanks and paratroopers, captured an artillery howitzer division of the enemy in the market square. The 2nd Assault Group, also consisting of 2 tanks, a reconnaissance platoon and a rifle platoon, was led by Senior Lieutenant Mayakin. This group was tasked to get to the theatre and defeat the enemy headquarters there. Mayakin's men acted boldly and swiftly. In half an hour, the senior lieutenant reported by radio that his group was in the theatre, captured prisoners, including 2 decent geese. I knew that Mayakin called geese fascist generals. At the same time, the senior lieutenant reported that his group took the theatre not alone, but in cooperation with scouts from the 121st Rifle Corps. So the neighbours on the left also came up. Now the fascists could not hold out for long, and indeed by 16 Sosaus on June 28th, Hitlerites stopped resistance. As a result of 2 days of fierce fighting, Mogilev was liberated. For courage and bravery shown by the personnel when breaking through the enemy's defences on the Pronya River, for skillful forcing of the Dnieper and participation in the battles for the liberation of the city of Mogilev, by the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR 290th Infantry Division was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, and by the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, it was given the honorary name of Mogilev Division. The 290th Infantry Division after the battles for Mogilev was as if in the rear of the main forces of the army, which, bypassing the city, continued the offensive to the west. Following the troops that had gone forward, the division units were simultaneously replenished with personnel, weapons, and ammunition, and often engaged in battles, destroying scattered groups of fascists wandering in our rear. But one day from the division headquarters reported that a large column of Hitlerites with tanks is moving along the road from the village of Esmony to Korytnitsa. "I entrust your regiment to defeat it," said the commander into the phone, "to reinforce the howitzer and anti-tank divisions. This alone indicated that the enemy's forces are not insignificant. I assess the situation and make a decision. The enemy is 8 to 10 kilometers away from us. So, we have time to intercept his column before it reaches the crossroads, Belinici, Berezino. The main forces of the regiment will strike from the rear, going there through the forest clearings. The 1st Battalion will intercept and delay the enemy. It should be reinforced by a division of the artillery regiment and an anti-tank division. And in order to get to the highway before the enemy and have time to occupy the defence there, the personnel of the battalion should be planted by landing on artillery tractors of both divisions. According to our calculations, the 1st Battalion had not yet passed more than 4,500 kilometres, when ahead heard the rattle of gunshots and rifle and machine gun crackle. There was no doubt he started a fight. By its intensity, it was felt that the battalion was dealing with an organised enemy, with a group of officers rode to the noise of the battle. Captain Hierney successfully chose a position, closed the exit from the forest, through which the enemy column moved to the village of Korytnitsa. The right flank company of the battalion took up the defence on the edge of the grove southeast of the village, the front to the northwest, cutting the country road to the village of Zabolotie, as well as 2 glades crossing the forest from north to south. In the centre of the combat order, directly at Korytnitsa, was the 2nd Company, covering the line of defence of the northern edge of the village, and the left flank saddled the road going to Verlevka. The 3rd Company occupied the defence on the left and slightly ahead. In its fighting order was deployed 335th Anti-Tank Division, commanded by Major V.K. Kuznetsov. Here was also with his control cell and the commander of the 1st Battalion. At the very moment when we appeared at the observation post at Hirny, up to a company of fascists with 4 tanks tried to break through to the village. But, having met organised rifle and machine gun and gunfire, losing almost immediately 2 tanks, the Nazis rolled back. Then the enemy decided to bypass Korytnitsa from the east, but by this manoeuvre put his right flank under the attack of the 2nd Company, and from the front it was met by fire of the 1st. Having lost several dozen more men, the enemy vanguard withdrew into the woods. Now, on the edge of the forest, began to accumulate in large numbers of enemy infantry with tanks, and deep in the forest hummed and hummed the engines of other vehicles. It would be the right time to strike the fascists with the main forces from the rear, but where are the 2nd and 3rd Battalions now? Will they be able to come in? A group of enemy officers appeared at the edge of the forest. They took a long look at the terrain and our defences with binoculars. Yes, their situation is difficult. On the right runs a rivulet with a heavily marshy floodplain, and on the left 2 sagebrush lines are firmly defended by our units. The column stands in the forest in a tight marching order. It is impossible to turn it back. So, the enemy has no other choice but to try to break through the village again. Our mortars opened fire on the edge of the forest, and the enemy officers hastily hid in the woods. And in their place, calculations began to roll out on a direct aiming guns, tanks and infantry moved forward. A new attack was imminent. The commanders of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions radioed that they had passed only halfway. Slowly, very slowly, asked the anti-tank division commander if he had shrapnel shells. Major Kuznetsov replied that there were, but not many, only 10 per gun. Then I asked him if his crews knew how to shoot ricochet shells. Kuznetsov looked at me carefully and said approvingly, "Wow. And I thought that the infantry does not understand anything in our business. But she, look at you, understands something. All right, we can ricochet. 12 76mm guns in the division, 10 shells each. 120 pieces, and even when firing on the ricochet, that means something." The commander of the 3rd Battalion reported that met on the way swamp and bypasses it. In the forest is very viscous, especially hard for mortars and machine gunners. The horses are exhausted and people have to help them. The 2nd Battalion by this time reached the village of Kulakovo, from which goes the road just to the rear of the fascists. But we still need to overcome 8 to 10 kilometres, which will take at least 2 hours. All this, taken together, aggravated the situation. After all, any minute now may begin an enemy attack, and the balance of forces is clearly not in our favour. In the reserve remained only a company of machine gunners. But that's not enough. I give an order by radio to the commander of the 3rd Battalion to leave mortars and machine guns with a small guard in the woods and go lightly into the rear of the enemy. And pace, hurried, and 2nd Battalion. In a few minutes, Hitlerites rushed to the breakthrough, opening fire on the 1st Battalion from all kinds of weapons. They attacked on the front not more than 1 kilometre, and on such a site concentrated 8 tanks, up to half a dozen armoured personnel carriers, as well as up to 2 battalions of infantry. The enemy's plan was to ram the combat order of our battalion in a narrow area, to break out of the trap, and moving through the forests to the southwest to reach the Berezina River. 4 enemy tanks were already approaching the positions of the 3rd Company, and 2 were rolling on the 2nd Company. I looked toward the anti-tank division commander. He was standing calmly in the gap between his 2 batteries and watching these enemy tanks through binoculars. Why is he slowing down? The angular TVs were about to roll into the trenches of the 3rd Company when the salvos of the division's right flank battery rang out. One of the tanks burst into flames and black smoke billowed from its stern. A few more shots rang out, and the 2nd tank spun in place. With 2 tanks aimed at the junction between the 2nd and 3rd Companies, the next artillery battery entered the fray. But at this time 2 more tanks, marching a little to the side, added speed and began to come to her flank. It was still hard, and the 3rd Company. There came a critical moment of the battle. The Nazis went into the attack as dumbfounded, not counting the losses. Time, it seems, to put into action, and its only reserve, a company of machine gunners. Just thought about it, as a nearby radio operator excitedly shouted, "3rd Battalion, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, the 3rd Battalion is on the line. He's already approached." That the 3rd Battalion came and struck from the rear, it was evident from the behaviour of the Hitlerites. They scattered across the battlefield, rushing to the woods, then again at us. I shouted to Captain Herney, "Raise your companies, fight towards the 3rd Battalion." Few Hitlerites managed to slip away from us and scatter in the forest. In this battle they lost up to 200 men killed, and about 800 surrendered as prisoners. 6 tanks were hit by us, and 2 were captured intact as trophies. They ran out of fuel. We also captured a lot of small arms, a large wagon, but while the regiment was smashing this column, other parts of the division went far to the west. We had to catch up with them. We came to the Berezina River 24 hours later than the other regiments. On June 30th, 290th Infantry Division became part of the 50th Army. Pursuing the enemy along the highway Mogilev, Minsk, by the end of July 1st, it came to the approaches to Zamostio and Cherveny, where the Nazis put up quite a strong resistance. Our regiment, having joined the main forces of the division, concentrated in the forest northwest of Cherven and formed its 2nd echelon. On the night of July 2nd, the Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel P.K. Kuzmin, informed me that the regiments of the 1st echelon are involved in a battle with a large group of the enemy, breaking through to the southwest in the area of Pravda, Grebenka, Chernograd, and Dia, and passed the order of the commander to raise the regiment and forced march to the area Drashkovo, Griva, Liadi, to ride there all the roads going south to prevent the enemy breakthrough to Smilovici. Move out immediately. When I returned to the location of the regiment, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. A candle was burning in the tent of the Chief of Staff, and I looked in on him. I saw Major Gladkey and his operator leaning over a map, drawing on it the situation given to them by someone on the telephone. "Kuzmin?" Gladkey explained in a half-whisper, covering the microphone with his palm, and nodded at the tube. "My Nachstaber not only prepared the map, he has already managed to give the command to raise the regiment and for the march. An hour later we marched. Regimental scouts, led by their platoon commander, Senior Lieutenant Mayakin, went ahead. At dawn they returned, and Mayakin reported that a large column of enemy infantry with artillery was moving along the road from Grebenok to Smilovici. Its head is already approaching the village of Griva. I measured the distance on the map. To Smilovici from the enemy 7.5 kilometers, from our vanguard battalion, 9. Yes, we need to intercept the enemy, not to let him cut the highway Mogilev, Minsk. The 1st Battalion with the regimental battery immediately rushed to intercept the column, and the main forces of the regiment on the deployment line to the right of the highway. I reported my decision by radio to the division commander. General Gasparian approved it, but warned that a rather large enemy column was rushing to Smilovici. "Act energetically, but at the same time cautiously," concluded his instructions. At 6:30, Captain Herney's battalion deployed on the heights south of the village of Laedi and met the enemy column with organised fire. A hot battle ensued. The fascists were pressing the 1st Battalion with fierceness. Their first 2 attacks, the force of up to 2 battalions of infantry supported by 2 batteries, the battalion repulsed, inflicting tangible losses on the enemy. After half an hour pause, Hitlerites, having pulled up from the depths of another battalion, began the third attack. 3 battalions of the enemy on 1 hour's, but enviable stamina and skill were shown in this battle by the commander Captain Hirny, the battalion's part-torg Senior Lieutenant Moshkov, the regiment's propagandist Captain Dobotkin, company commanders Lieutenant Malkin and Senior Lieutenant Gavrilov. With their courageous actions they inspired the whole personnel of the battalion, and the attack was again repulsed. Moreover, the 1st Battalion even undertook a counter-attack, destroying during it up to 150 enemy soldiers and officers, and more than 300 taken prisoner. Only a few scattered groups of Hitlerites managed to break through in the direction of the village of Zapolye, and thus avoided death or capture. In total, for July 2nd, the regiment destroyed up to 400 and took prisoner about 1,500 fascists. 9 guns, about 24 mortars, many machine guns and other small arms were captured. And on July 3rd, we learned that the troops of the 3rd and 1st Belarusian fronts liberated the city of Minsk from the Nazi invaders. This news instantly spread throughout the regiment. Rallies were held in the battalions. There was no limit to our joy. After liquidation of the remnants of the 12th and 27th Army Corps, as well as the 39th Tank Corps of the encircled south and southeast of Minsk group of German troops, the 290th Infantry Division, moving in the direction of Samokhvalovichi, Zhivichi and Kotoshani, by the morning of 14.7/1944, came to the line of the Pira River near Zhidomli. Our regiment, together with the attached 1420th Artillery Regiment of the division, acted now in the vanguard, and had to ensure the rapid advance of the main forces of the 290th Infantry to the Neman River, north of Grodno. The border Zhidomlia, Yurievichi the enemy defended with the forces of 1068th, 1069th and 1065th Grenadier Regiments, hastily transferred here from near Warsaw. Especially the Hitlerites attached great importance to the retention of the district centre Zhidomlia, the junction of the highway and railway leading to Grodno. At 6 miles, our reconnaissance reported that the fascists, with the strength of up to an infantry battalion, occupied the defence, saddling the road Skidel, Zhidomlia, calling the head of the column of combatants. I, having given the Chief of Staff an order to prepare the regiment for battle, and indicating to the commander of the artillery regiment the area of firing positions, jumped together with them by car to the heights, which is 1.5 kilometers from Tsudziki. It was necessary to clarify the situation. Hitlerites, apparently, did not expect us at such an early hour. Through binoculars we could see the soldiers undressed, in only shirts, who were lazily digging trenches. Some of them, gathered in groups of 2 or 3 people, were talking and smoking. On the northeastern edge of the village of Tsudziki stood an unmasked 75mm gun. Its calculation also leisurely prepared a firing position. It was not difficult for us to shoot down this battalion. But ahead, we knew it too. Up to a regiment of enemy infantry was defending, saddling already the railroad Mosti, Grodno. Here we'll have to make a lot of trouble. I'm carefully studying the enemy's defence. On the right, 1 kilometre from the railroad, there is a highway from Skidel to Zhidomlia, and further to Grodno. To the right, there is a ridge of small heights. Here the fascists' defence should be the strongest. Of course, the heights dominated the terrain. And here, yes, the section between the railroad and the highway is the weakest place. Here the high railway embankment as if cuts the Hitlerites' defence in two. Therefore, fire interaction between his units is excluded. In turn, the embankment will cover the left flank of our regiment from the flank and oblique fire of the enemy defending on the other side of the railroad. The decision was self-evident. To strike the main blow with the left flank of the regiment on the section between the highway and the railroad, to break through the defence of the fascist regiment here, and seize the station Zhidomlia. After a 15-minute fire attack, the 1st and 3rd battalions went on the attack and began to move forward quickly. The enemy tried to counterattack our regiment in the flank with the force of up to a company of machine gunners with 2 Ferdinands, but immediately ran into the second echelon of the regiment, turned by this time the front to the north. The machine gunners were shot almost at point-blank range. Only a few of them managed to hide in a grove. One Ferdinand was hit by our Petenerovtsi, and the other, stumbling backwards, lodged in the swamp. Its crew began to leave the trapped vehicle, but was immediately destroyed. Continuing to move forward, the 3rd Battalion by noon engaged in a battle for the Zhytomlya station, but was unable to seize it from the start. The 1st Battalion's initial attempt to take the village of Zhytomlya was unsuccessful. Under heavy artillery and mortar fire, both battalions lay down and began to entrench. By the intensity and accuracy of artillery and mortar fire, it was clear that the enemy had skillfully prepared firing lines. And he also had time to equip the defence. On some parts of the terrain, especially on the slopes of the hills facing our direction, binoculars were visible full profile and carefully camouflaged trenches. And the activity of machine gun fire indicated that in the enemy's defence quite sufficient density of this type of weapon, especially rampant fascist machine guns at the railroad station Zhytomlya. From there, several handheld machine guns and one large-caliber machine gun were beating simultaneously. In addition, the brick 2-storied building of the station was noticeably elevated above the terrain, and this gave the fascists the opportunity to view from his attic not only the regiment's fighting order, but also deep in our rear, to correct the fire of their artillery. I reported by radio the situation to the division commander. "What do you think to do?" he asked. I said that I would still try to take the railroad station to deprive the enemy of the advantage in watching us. To break through his defence to its full depth without proper preparation, independently regiment cannot. Major General Gasparian approved my decision and gave me 2 hours to take the station. Then he informed me that he decided to engage the 882nd Rifle Regiment on the right, bypassing the village of Zhytomlya. Our regiment, when the battalions of the 882nd Rifle went on the offensive, was to attack the enemy also in the village of Zhytomlya, and, having captured it, to go to Grodno. Then the division commander said that the 1420th Artillery Regiment, without one division, he redirected from me to ensure the entry into the battle of the 882nd Rifle Regiment. One division still remains at my disposal. I tried to object, to convince the commander that he did not take away from me the entire artillery regiment, arguing that the enemy's defence here is saturated with a large number of firing points, identified, and several of his artillery batteries. The general dryly replied that there were also many enemy fire points and artillery batteries in front of the division, but he had no artillery except for the artillery regiment. There was nothing to do. The order must be carried out. I called the chief of artillery of the regiment to me and asked him to report what we would have left with the departure of the 1420th Artillery Regiment. And here is the layout. 13 mortars of 82 mm caliber, 4 mortars of 120 mm battery, and 2 .76 guns. Total 19 units, plus 11 122 meters howitzers of the artillery division attached to the regiment. Not much. But we have already discovered and detected about 15 machine gun nests in the enemy's defence, and there will be no less waiting for their hour. And the enemy's artillery batteries? There was only one way out. We would have to suppress the enemy's fire points in succession. At once we distributed. To the artillery division to start with destruction of firing points at the station, 76 mm guns of the regiment, also to roll out on direct aiming, and to beat from them on windows of the second floor of the building of the railway station, to blind observation artillery points of the enemy. By the fire of the regiment's minirot and mortar battery, suppress the machine guns on the right and left of the station. The artillery attack should be short, no more than 5 minutes, but at maximum mode. The 1st Battalion, as soon as the guns and mortars open fire, assists them with all kinds of small arms. The 3rd Battalion, on the other hand, rushes forward, firing on the move at the trenches and windows of the first floor of the station building. After capturing the station, it takes the defence in the trench of the enemy and is prepared to repel his possible counterattacks. The 2nd Battalion, with the transition to the attack of the 3rd, quickly occupies its former starting point in readiness at the first signal to develop success. By 15 Alsan, this task was communicated to all unit commanders. Artillerymen and mortarmen were still shooting targets. Battalions prepared for battle. At the signal, 3rd Battalion went into the attack, and immediately raged dense and fairly accurate barrage of enemy artillery, spoke machine guns and machine guns of the enemy. The battalion, having suffered losses, lay down. Its repeated attack was also unsuccessful. Yes, the enemy was able to figure out our plan, and now concentrated fire on the 3rd Battalion from all kinds of weapons. His fighters began to entrench themselves. About the situation reported to the division commander. Heard in response quite sharp admonitions in his address, and the order to prepare for further action in conjunction with the 882nd Rifle Regiment, having ordered the Chief of Artillery to prepare a new firing raid on the front edge of enemy defences, clarified the task to the combatants, decided once again to talk to the division commander about the inexpediency of fighting before darkness, observation of the enemy, the activity of his artillery, saturation of the defence with a large number of machine guns, including large calibre, a significant density of infantry in the trenches. Everything said that the Nazis will continue to fight hard. In addition, they have behind their back is quite an advantageous strategic boundary, the Naman River, which the enemy will not leave so easily. And another thing, east of the Naman, the enemy has a lot of different warehouses and rear bases with a lot of material, weapons, ammunition, fuel and food. All this still has to be evacuated, transported to the western bank. That's why the Nazis will fight here, on the close approaches to the city of Grodno, to the last. General Gasparian listened to my arguments in silence without interrupting. Then he asked, "So what exactly do you suggest?" Not to carry out the attack before daylight. Give the commanders a chance to put the units in order, feed the men, give the personnel some rest. And during this time bring more shells, mines, grenades and ammunition. The attack to begin at dawn, when the Nazis will go to sleep. Comdiv, after a little silence, still said as cut off, "Get ready for the attack." A few minutes passed after the conversation with General Gasparian. The commanders of the 1st and 3rd Battalions reported that they were ready to attack. I was only waiting for the report of the Chief of Artillery. At the same time, Captain V.T. Vlasenko was loudly arguing with someone on the phone. There were about 5 minutes before the start of the fire attack. I approached, touched Vlasenko's shoulder, showed him my watch. He hung up the telephone receiver and, annoyingly flaring his nostrils, reported, "In the Min battery of the regiment, shells put out of action 2 mortars. Both calculations were killed. In the mortar companies of the 1st and 3rd Battalions left only 10 mines per barrel. They tried to bring ammunition to the firing positions during the attack on the station, but both wagons with mines fell under artillery attack and were scattered. It was getting worse by the hour. Suddenly we heard the voice of the radio operator, Corporal Kochetkov. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, the commander is for you." I put on my earphones. I heard the hoarse voice of Isaac Gasparovich. "Komolo, our conversation was correct. We'll act as you said. Wait for a radio from me." My heart was immediately relieved. That General Gasparian is a clever man. Even though he swore, but after weighing all pros and cons, he still agreed with me. And how pleasant it is for a subordinate to be considered by his seniors. It develops his initiative, teaches him to think, weigh, deeply analyse the situation, and draw the right conclusions from it. And without acquiring these qualities, one cannot become a full-fledged commander. At 23:00, a radiogram was received, a combat order from the division commander. The regiment was ordered to defeat the units of the 1069th Grenadier Regiment of the Nazis by night attack and take possession of the village and the railway station Zhidomlya. At dawn, to develop the offensive in the direction of the 43rd kilometre. Readiness for action, 2.0, 14.7. The beginning of the attack, by additional order. Battalion commanders and artillerymen reported that brought ammunition for all types of weapons. Personnel fed hot food. Soldiers were given dry rations. Gunners of the regiment repaired by this time 120mm mortar. The main blow on the station was to be, as before, to strike the 3rd Battalion. The 1st, acting on the right flank of the regiment, was aimed at capturing the village. The division commander scheduled the attack for 3:15, just an hour before sunrise. He apparently expected that the battalions of the 1st Echelon of the 878th and 892nd Rifle Regiments, under the cover of still relative darkness, will be able to seize the strongholds on the front line of the enemy's defence, and then, with dawn, it will be possible to build on their success by the introduction of the 2nd Echelons into the battle. From the very first minutes, the enemy gave us stubborn resistance. As we learned later, he waited all night for the beginning of our attacks. We understood that the Russians would stop at nothing to break through our defences. After all, from here to the border with Poland is only a few kilometres, and the Russians will, not counting any losses, attack and attack to get to this border faster. So said to me a captured Ober-Unter from the 1069th Grenadier Regiment, but that will be later. In the meantime, several enemy batteries instantly responded to our first volley, and dozens of enemy machine guns began to whistle. An avalanche of lead and metal hit the chains of the advancing battalions. Seeing all this, I repeated mentally like an incantation. Only if the battalions did not lie down, only if they did not lie down, not to lie down, to skip the enemy barricade, to get closer. When specifying the task to the battalion commanders, it was told especially. The political workers of the regiment and battalions also did their best to instill in the personnel, in no case to lie down prematurely. Forward, only forward. This is salvation. I remembered, returning from the 3rd Battalion a few minutes before the attack, the regiment's deputy commander, Major Petushkov, assured me, "Don't worry, Mikhail. The men themselves understand everything perfectly well. I was in the 7th and 9th companies. Their losses are large, left on average 35 to 40 people, but the spirit of combat. The commander of the 7th Company, Sergeant Terekin, who now heads the 2nd Platoon, assured me that they will take the station by all means. During the day, he said, we have established that there is a kind of dead space to the right of the platform. The platoon will attack in that direction. The enemy machine guns won't get him there. We received a report that the 9th Company had already crossed the railroad bed and was now preparing for a new attack on the other side of the road. The company commander, Junior Lieutenant S.P. Strumentov, reported that the approaches to the station are covered by a thick palisade, and this gives him the opportunity to concentrate unnoticed by the enemy at a close distance from the building and rush, in a matter of minutes, to seize the station. Captain Dabotkin, the regimental agitator, returned from the 1st Battalion. He reported that the part-torg of the battalion, Senior Lieutenant Motkov and other communists, were the first to go forward, dragging the rest of the fighters behind them. At that time, several enemy shells exploded in close proximity to the observation post. The raid was repeated twice. Apparently, the fascist artillerymen yesterday detected the accumulation of people here. We must be careful, don't stick out unnecessarily, and don't huddle. The station's on fire. There was a cheer. All those who were at the observation post turned their heads in the direction of the station. Yes, indeed, from several windows of the lower floor of the station building, red flames were breaking out. Call the commander of the 3rd Battalion to the telephone, I ordered the Chief of Staff. Captain Dusanov reported that the 9th Company of his battalion had broken into the station building and was now smoking out the Nazis. The 7th and 8th Companies are engaged in a firefight in the first trench of the enemy. They can't advance any further. Reinforce the 9th Company at the expense of the 8th. Hold the station at all costs. Go to the building yourself, knock out the fascists, and report. With these words, I finished my conversation with the commander of the three. The commander of the 1st Battalion, Captain Herney, also soon reported that his company had captured the trench of the enemy, began to move to the village of Zhidomlia, but met heavy Hitlerite fire and so far lay down. But now he will raise them. In the east, the dawn was already in full bloom. According to the situation, it would be time to build up the regiment's blow at the expense of entering the second echelon into the battle. But it had not yet properly dawned, and the enemy had not fully disclosed his retaliatory plan. Ideally, he should undertake a counterattack towards Żytomli. That's when we can make a decision on the introduction of the second echelon. At 4:15, the commander of the 3rd Battalion reported that the station Żytomlia completely in our hands. But the further advance of the companies suspended by heavy enemy fire. The 1st Battalion had already attacked the village of Żytomlia twice, but both attacks were repulsed by Hitlerites. And then the Chief of Staff, Major T.G. Gladky, reported that the 882nd Rifle Regiment also has no success. In short, the situation is difficult. I was called to the Apparatus Division commander. After hearing the report, Isaac Gasparovich expressed his dissatisfaction with the slow progress of the regiment, reproached that I had guaranteed him the success of the night attack, but it has not yet. Then he asked if I had put the second echelon into action. No, I replied, and immediately expressed his fears, as if the enemy did not throw something. We must wait, but the second echelon is ready for action. Bring it in immediately, ordered the commander. Stefanenko also enters. I ask you to switch to support the regiment at least one more division of the artillery regiment. I have heavy losses in mortar units. No, the commander replied briefly, and that was the end of the conversation. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, making up the second echelon of the regiment, was immediately specified the task: to enter the battle from behind the left flank of the 1st Battalion, and, bypassing the village of Żytomlia from the south, in cooperation with him to seize it. Soon the 2nd Battalion, advancing in the direction indicated to it, cut the road going from the village of Żytomlia to the station. But suddenly from behind the railroad bed was counterattacked by the enemy, and quite significant forces. Up to a battalion of infantry with 3 tanks. A difficult battle ensued. It lasted till the very afternoon. Twice Hitlerites pushed the battalion away from the road, but every time he saddled it again. In the end, the road remained behind the 2nd Battalion. Soon the enemy with the strength of up to 2 companies began to counterattack the 3rd Battalion. And although the first onslaught of the enemy was repulsed, it did not bring real calm. After all, I knew that in the last battles, including yesterday's, companies of this battalion suffered the greatest losses, and the railroad station must be held, no matter what it cost us. I had to send to the 3rd Battalion of his deputy Major B.A. Vinogradov and put him personally responsible for the defence of the station. Meanwhile, the enemy counterattacks followed one after another. 7 times had to repel them on July 14th, both the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. The night of July 15th was relatively quiet. The regiment's units regrouped under cover of darkness, improved their defences, preparing to repel new enemy counterattacks in the morning. The 6th Company, which had been in my reserve until then, was returned to the 2nd Battalion. With it, we strengthened the junction between the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. In the reserve of the regiment remained now only a company of machine gunners. As the sun rose, the enemy launched 2 simultaneous attacks. Up to 1.5 companies, at the junction of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 2 companies at the Żytomlia station. But both attacks were repulsed with great losses for Hitlerites. The commanders of mortar companies Senior Lieutenant E. A. Kondratiev and Captain A. M. Larin distinguished themselves. Having successfully chosen places for firing positions, they sent their mines into the very thick of enemy chains. Heroically fought, and machine gunners, G.Y. Gaev, I.F. Chudinov, and T.T. Binderev. In front of their positions we then counted up to 100 killed Hitlerite soldiers and officers. Wit and ingenuity not once showed in battle, and the commander of the 9th Company, Junior Lieutenant S.P. Strumentov, commander of the 2nd Battalion, Captain M.I. Piatirikov, partisan of the 1st Battalion Senior Lieutenant I.E. Moshkov, and many other soldiers of the regiment. During a day and a half, the fascists tried day and night to push the battalions of the regiment from the occupied lines, to correct the disadvantageous position for them. Then there was a lull. It was felt that there was a break in our favour. At 16 hours, the commanders of the 1st and 2nd Battalions were ordered to continue advancing in the directions previously indicated to them, and in an hour the enemy was knocked out of the settlement. Zhytomlya began to withdraw in small groups towards Grodno. The regiment started to pursue him, but after taking possession of the 43rd kilometre pass from the division headquarters, a radiogram was received, which ordered to consolidate on the achieved line, to provide with fire the 885th Regiment to enter the battle. In these heavy battles we inflicted considerable damage to the enemy. About 300 of his soldiers and officers were killed, several hundred wounded, captured 1 tank, more than 24 field guns, about 30 mortars, 40 machine guns, several dozen prisoners. But also units of the regiment suffered heavy losses in personnel and equipment, especially severely thinned companies of the 3rd Battalion. Dusk came. I received a call from the division headquarters informing me that General Gasparian summoned me to his office. "Gather the regiment, put it in order," said the division commander, giving me his hand as soon as I crossed the threshold. "You will go 3rd behind the 882nd Regiment," he continued, and, holding my hand, looked intently into my eyes. He finished briefly. "And for your steadfastness, thank you. Why in the 3rd echelon? He thanks me for perseverance, but when success is in sight, when it is necessary to pursue the enemy, to force the Niemen, you should be in the rear," flashed in my head. "Comrade General, how can it be?" I involuntarily burst out. 878th is not used to being dragged behind, to hide behind someone else's back. "No one is used to it," said the general. But, wise by service and worldly experience, he certainly understood the state of his subordinate, and therefore added, "My dear Komolo, there are still battles ahead. Many times you will be on the edge of the main strike. There will be enough hot days for each of us, and your regiment got more than enough for these 2 days of fighting. We must give the men a break." The commander thought about it, and then continued. "Good regiment would be 5 days of rest should rest, replenish. But that's the situation. The march in the 3rd echelon is considered a rest." And, as if ashamed of this kindness of his, he switched to an official tone. "We've talked. That's enough. Execute the order." Yes, in the harsh frontline environment, people are stingy on the manifestation of feelings. And for the year and a half that I fought in the 290th Division, starting from near Smolensk, not so often I had to hear heartfelt words from the commander. Only submissions for awards and promotions testified that the commander of the 878th Rifle Regiment was not on his last account. Later, the Chief of Staff of the division passed me a conversation between General Gasparian and the commander. I had noticed Komolo as a battalion commander. When the time came, he promoted him to deputy commander of the regiment, Gasparian said about me. And now he is already a lieutenant colonel, successfully commanding the regiment. He's only 24 years old, but he has enough combat experience for 3 men. But the commander and the commander-in-chief were talking among themselves. And in my life, I've been beaten up more than once by General Gasparian, although he trusted me a lot. Dusk had already begun to descend to the ground, when our regiment in a marching column moved after the rest of the division to the west. In the vanguard, the 1st Battalion, as the most combat-ready and by the number of personnel, and by the experience of the commander Captain Herney, from him, as it should be, the head marching outpost, and behind the entire regiment, Major G.T. Petushkov and I, passing by all the units, rejoiced at the tightness and organization of people, and then rode forward to the vanguard. Although the division units are ahead of our regiment, but still on the march it is better to be in the head. I know from experience anything can happen. The soldiers are marching moderately. At breaks in the air, smells of tobacco smoke. By front habit, people smoke in their sleeves and go on the road again. Horses pulling two 76mm regimental guns snort occasionally. Wagons carrying mortars, ammunition and other property squeak on potholes. The roads in western Belorussia are more or less bearable. Even asphalt pavement has been preserved somewhere. And the weather is good. The night is quiet, warm, the sky is starry, as if there were no war, to somehow drive away the lulling tranquility, I tell Major Petushkov. But we are now just in those places where Soviet soldiers 3 years ago took the first blow of the Nazis. That's right, responded the deputy commander, and I somehow did not think about it. We need to go to the soldiers, remind them. Well, it won't hurt, I agreed. But here's another thing. I had an opportunity to meet with those who came out of the encirclement near Moscow. In one voice they said that some people were let down by carelessness here. I get the hint, Commander. Indeed, we need to cheer people up, not to demagnetize. No sooner had the silhouette of the deputy dissolved in the darkness as the Chief of Staff arrived, Major Gladky. He was 2 years younger than me, and therefore somehow emphasized addressing me by name and patronymic. Mikhail Grigorievich, intelligence reported that ahead of Grodno. It can't be. The fascists are unlikely to leave the city without a fight. And the shooting? Then where are the other regiments of the division? I think they've gone sideways, along this road here. The Chief of Staff shone a flashlight on the map and showed a country road that skirts the city and leads to the forest area on the bank of the river. Stop the regiment. Platoon commander of the reconnaissance platoon to me. The commander of the reconnaissance platoon ran up and reported, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, Senior Lieutenant Mayakin has arrived on your orders. And at that very moment, the silence of the summer night was broken by artillery volleys. The crackle of machine gun bursts. Fiery trails of bullets and shells stretched to the place where approximately should have been our head camping outpost. Fascists. It turns out that we can't avoid the battle. We can't delay. It's tantamount to defeat. I give the command. Captain Herney, battalion to battle. Move along the road. Major Gladky, tell the 2nd Battalion to Captain Piatirikov to turn the battalion to the left of the road. Mayakin, run to the 3rd Battalion. He'll advance on the right. Clarification of tasks took place on the move. Judging by the flashes of shots, the Hitlerites did not have a solid defence. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions could cover the enemy positions from the flanks, and to their commanders were immediately sent messengers with this order. The 1st Battalion is still moving along the road with the task to reach the area of Grodno railway station, and then by all means capture the railroad bridge. Even now, after more than 30 years, I am inclined to believe that then our regiment just smiled at military luck. After all, the forces of the Hitlerites defending the city were unknown to us, and the regiment, which had suffered losses in the battles, was not such a large unit to storm a city of such magnitude as Grodno alone. Still, we took a risk and moved battalions to its outskirts. We hoped that other units and formations approaching the city would help us. We had surprise on our side. But how best to use it? Certainly by concentrating all our efforts on capturing the vital points of the city, and first of all the river crossings. Then we must break through, making as much noise as possible. Let the imagination of the enemy, not seeing at night the number of advancing, doubles our forces. So reasoned my Chief of Staff and I. In a matter of minutes, we thought over the decision. The 1st Battalion almost immediately captured the station, but did not linger there. On the left was a military town, from the direction of which there was disorganized shooting. I sent there only scouts, but did not allow the battalion to be distracted. It is more important for him to seize the railroad bridge across the Niemen. It's not far away, just 1.5 kilometers. Forward, Herney, forward, I encouraged the commander. Piatirikov's battalion is already fighting on the square behind the church. And you? Push on. How could Captain Herney lag behind his neighbour? No way. And he pushed on. Who distinguished himself in that battle? If we were to take this case, we'd have to list all the soldiers and commanders of the regiment. Artillerymen fearlessly shot the Hitlerites running out of the fortress, which was behind the church, and trying to resist. Regimental and battalion mortarmen literally filled both military towns with mines, hit the fascists who settled in the cemetery near the railroad bridge. Sappers quickly made passages in the barriers, and as soon as the units reached the shore, under the command of Regimental Engineer Major B.Y. Kavronsky, having found boats, began to make the crossing. Everyone showed heroism and fearlessness. In the east it was already dawning when Captain Herney reported that his battalion had jumped the railroad bridge and was fighting on the western bank of the Niemen. Captain Pyatirikov reported that no one was resisting him. Major Gladky and his staff, meanwhile, moved to the area of the church, established communication with the division headquarters and battalions. I order him, tell the division headquarters that the pre-Riverside part of Grodno was taken by us in the night battle. Regiment 1 Battalion caught on the opposite bank. I'm taking measures to expand the bridgehead. But a few minutes later, the strongest explosion rumbled, and the middle spans of the railroad bridge flew into the air. It turned out that our sappers had not had time to detect and neutralize the explosive charges cleverly hidden by the Nazis, and the Nazis were able to blow up the bridge by remote control. The position of the regiment became more complicated. On this side of the Niemen, the enemy is partly destroyed, partly dispersed or thrown back over the river. But the 1st Battalion on the other side, it found itself cut off from the regiment, and, as Herney soon radioed, it is being counter-attacked there by quite a considerable force. What to do, how to help the battalion? While I was thinking, a radiogram came. In it, a member of the Military Council of the 2nd Belarusian Front congratulates all the personnel of the regiment with the achieved success, informs that I was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. I hold this radiogram in my hands and do not know whether to rejoice or to grieve. After all, if the regiment does not hold the bridgehead on the other bank, the whole army will be disgraced. You stay here, put this part of town in order and bring up the rear. And me and the Deputy Chief of Staff, to the other side, I say to the Chief of Staff, isn't it a little early, Mikhail Grigorievich? No, I must be there. Let's go to the place where sappers under the command of the Regimental Engineer Major Kavronsky set up a boat crossing. By the way, the rowers on the boats were not only fighters, but also local residents, men and even women. It was to the boat with one of them, and brought me Kavronsky said, "Sit down with her, she won't let you down." He manages the boat masterfully. I was personally convinced. "All right," I nodded, jumping with my companions into a dull-looking boat. I ordered the regimental engineer, 2 platoons of sappers with mines to immediately transfer to the other side. Assign them to the 1st Battalion, mine the streets and other tank-hazardous passages. "It will be done," answered Kavronsky. "The Niemen carries its waters quickly." Yes, and the boat glided quite smoothly on its surface. But even faster flew a heavy German shell. Fortunately, it did not hit the boat, but exploded nearby in the depths. And still the wave overturned the small boat. Everyone surfaced, only the radio went to the bottom. It was good that the radio operator, Lieutenant Kochetkov, took it off his back when landing. Otherwise, we reached the shore by swimming. The news that the regiment commander was with them on this shore instantly spread among the soldiers, gave them confidence in their abilities. After all, the frontline soldiers knew that as soon as the senior chief personally directs the battle, everything possible will be done to hold the occupied positions. And there will be no turning back. And we not only repel counterattacks, but also squeeze the enemy little by little, reported the deputy commander of the battalion on the political part of Captain A.P. Korchagin. Fighters fight like lions. Red Army man Sudakov, for example, personally killed 9 Hitlerites. And the first to break into this shore was the commissar of the machine gun company, Senior Sergeant Kurbatov. Be sure to present all the distinguished for awards and pass the lists to Major Petushkov, I ordered. By the way, where is the part-torg of the battalion? Senior Lieutenant Moshkov with the 1st Company. They are smoking out the Hitlerites from the tobacco factory buildings, but if necessary, I'll call him now. You don't have to. I just wanted him, as a party leader, to testify that today I did not by my own free will soak my party card. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, the whole battalion will confirm it. Meanwhile, it became known that the division commander decided to enter the battle southeast of the railroad bridge, 885th Rifle Regiment. To help him with the crossing, I directed the 2nd Battalion to start advancing along the riverbank. In the first hours of the battle, success was indicated, but by evening the situation became more complicated. On the direction of our main blow, Hitler's command began to hastily transfer parts of the SS Motorized Division Deadhead, and directly in the combat area of the 2nd Battalion of the regiment companies, trying to advance along the coastal strip, Hitlerites threw grenades from a steep cliff, and those, pressed at the foot of the cliff, suffered heavy losses, not being able either to leap forward or to turn back. With the onset of darkness, of course, they will be able to break out of this trap, I said bitterly to the deputy. But the losses? We have made a mistake here. We must urgently look for a way out. And what if the idea, born in my head, was simple and daring, taking advantage of the fact that the fascists have no solid defence here yet, to send to their rear regimental scouts with a good supply of grenades, and when Senior Lieutenant Mayakin and his men will put into action pocket artillery, will bring panic in the rear of the Nazis, the units of the 2nd Battalion will rush up, attack, and knock the enemy off the cliff. Well, if the scouts will be able to penetrate into the rear of the enemy, then success, of course, will be ensured. Having heard this plan of mine, Major Petushkov agreed. I will do the training of scouts myself, and you go to the 2nd Battalion, explain the task. The attack at 2 a.m. By dawn we need to have time to gain a foothold. The deputy commander left. The sudden blow from two sides literally stunned the fascists. The whole coast was soon in our hands, and then units of the regiment broke into the territory of large warehouses and began to clear it from the Nazis. At the same time, the 1st Battalion, taking advantage of the fact that the attention of the fascists was distracted by the battle on the outskirts of the back part of the city, also improved its position by knocking out the enemy from the tobacco factory. The morning came. At 10 Auxerre, after a short but intense artillery preparation, the main forces of the division, as well as cavalrymen, tankers, other rifle units that had approached the city, forcing the Namen, began to stream from both sides of the part of the city that was on the west bank of the river. The enemy, after a short resistance, began to withdraw hastily, leaving hundreds of corpses and their military equipment in the streets of Grodno. By the second half of the day, our troops had already reached the line of Tarasuche, Tchekovshizna, Skomoroshki, thus completing the complete liberation of Grodno from the Nazi occupants. In these battles we lost many of our comrades in arms. One of my best combatants, Captain I, P. Hierney, was mortally wounded. P. Kearney, Senior Lieutenants M. M. Zagulyaev, I. Z. Gavrilov, N. F. Fominsky, gave their lives and company commanders, pursuing the retreating enemy units along the highway Grodno, Dombrovo. The Soviet troops, by the evening of July 24th, had already reached the state border of the USSR. Our 878th Rifle Regiment was the first to reach it at height 235, 5 kilometers to the west of Vakuni settlement,